Superhero is a new one, so thank you for that. I'm really, really delighted to get to be here today, and particularly to get to see some of the conversations that are going to take place over the course of the afternoon. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to be part of this. Part of what you're going to get today, if you happen to have read Generous Thinking, is going to sound a little familiar. But I want to give you the setup, which is some of the, why? Why do we need to make these changes? Why do we need to save the university? So there's a little bit of necessarily negative stuff in the first part of this talk, but I'm hopeful that we're leading toward the positive, toward the kinds of things that your afternoon will ultimately be all about. So that's the trajectory of where I'm going to go. The talk does draw heavily on various parts of the book, which came out in February from Johns Hopkins. The overall argument of the book as a whole is that the future of higher education really depends on institutions and on those of us who are part of those institutions successfully building engaged, trusting relationships with the publics that our universities are intended to serve. Now, this is perhaps a bit more obvious for public institutions like the one that I work for, but I believe that it's no less true of private institutions, which depend on various kinds of public support for their success. Now, that we need to place some emphasis on building these relationships between our institutions and our publics can be seen in the results of an increasing number of reports and studies such as this one, which was released in 2017 by the Pew Research Center. The report documents a precipitous decline in the esteem that colleges and universities are held in the United States, and particularly on the political right. It's not a surprise, right? We've seen this kind of shift in public opinion taking root for some time. Typically, our response on campus to this kind of report has been, to decry the rampant anti-intellectualism in contemporary culture and to sort of turn inward, to spend more time talking internally with those who really understand what it is that we do and why. And in that reaction, part of what I'm arguing is that we run the risk of deepening the divide, right? Of allowing those who want us to fade into irrelevance to say to one another, see, they're out of touch, right? Who needs them anyway? So it's important for us to remember that this shift in public opinion that we're seeing here didn't just happen by itself, right? It was made to happen as part of a program of discrediting and privatizing public institutions and public services across the nation. However, from time to time, we are confronted with undeniable evidence that many of our institutions, and even those institutions that most profess their commitment to public service, have utterly betrayed the trust that has been placed in them. Which is to say that the problem is not just that the public fails to understand the importance of what we do, it's also that we have in many ways failed. We failed to make that importance clear. We failed to protect our communities, both on campus and off. We failed to build institutions that are genuinely, structurally capable of living out the values that they profess. So a large part of what I'm after in Generous Thinking is to press for new ways of understanding our institutions as communities, as well as in interaction with communities, asking us to take a closer look at the ways that we communicate both with one another and with a range of broader publics about and around our work. And some focused thinking about that mode of public engagement is in order, I would suggest, because our institutions are facing a panoply of crises that we cannot solve on our own. Now, these crises don't always give the impression of being of the kind or degree of the highly volatile political, economic, and environmental situation that we're currently living through. And yet, the decline in public support for higher education is of a piece with those other crises, part of a series of national and international transformations in assumptions about the responsibility of governments for the public good. I mean, the very notion, in fact, that there can be such a thing as the public good And the consequences of those transformations are indeed life and death in many cases. So while my argument about the importance of generosity for the future of the university may at times sound a little bit self-indulgent, right? A sort of head in the sand retreat into philosophizing and niceness and a refusal of real political action, I hope in the book to have put together a case for why this is not so. Right? Why, in fact, the particular modes of generous thinking that I'm asking us to undertake within and around the university have the potential to help us navigate the present crises by which we're beset. I mean, many of our fields, after all, are already focused on pressing public issues, and many of us are already working in very publicly engaged ways. But we need to generalize that engagement and to think about the ways that it might, if permitted, really transform the institution and the ways that we all work within it. So that is to say, the best of what the university has to offer today, what matters most, may lie less in its power to advance knowledge in any of its particular fields than in its ability to be a model and a support for the kind of generous thinking that we want to present as a way of being in and with the world. Okay, first of all, who is this we that I keep talking about? What is it that we do, and why does it matter? Much of what I've written about focuses on the university's permanent faculty, partially because that faculty is my community of practice, and partially because of the extent to which the work that's done by the faculty on campus is higher education, right? Research and teaching are the primary purposes and outputs of our institutions. Moreover, the principles of shared governance under which we operate, at least in theory, suggest that tenured and tenure-track faculty members have a significant responsibility for shaping the future of the university. But I want to acknowledge that it's important to be careful in deploying this we. As Helen Small has pointed out, the first person plural is a rhetorical sleight of hand by which the concerns of the profession can be made to seem entirely congruent with those of the democratic polity as a whole. So while I hope that my argument has something important to say to folks who work on university campuses but are not faculty, or who don't work on university campuses at all, that kind of connection really can't be assumed. It would be great if we could make it possible for the we that I end up focusing on here to refer to all of us, on campus and off, who want to strengthen both our systems of higher education and our ways of engaging with one another in order to help us all build stronger communities, in order to ensure that all of us count. But that, of course, is part of the work ahead. It's important, in no small part, to be careful about how we define that us, precisely because every us implies a them. And the ways that we define and conceive of that them points to one of the problems with the contemporary university, and especially public universities in the United States. And these institutions were founded explicitly in service to the people of their states or regions or communities, and thus those publics should be understood as part of the larger us. And yet, the borders of the campus have done more than simply define a space. They end up determining a sense of belonging as well, transforming everything off campus into a them, right, a generalized other. Now, granted, sometimes they are imagined to be the audience for our performances, right, a group that benefits from the work that we do and that takes in information that we provide. But what might it mean if we were to understand ourselves and our institutions as embedded in and responsible to the complex collection of communities by which we're surrounded? How might we begin to develop a richer sense, not just of them, but of the us that we together form? I mean, we talk, after all, a lot about community on campus, both about community engagement and about the university itself as a community, but we don't often talk about what it is that we mean when we invoke the concept. Miranda Joseph, in her wonderful book, Against the Romance of Community, I would highly recommend this if you're interested, explores the ways that the term community gets mythologized, romanticized, and so comes to serve what she calls a supplementary role with respect to capitalism, right? Filling its gaps and smoothing over its flaws in ways that permit it to function without real opposition. Additionally, community, as she argues, in the singular particularly, right, the community, runs the risk of becoming a kind of disciplinary force, a declaration of groupness that's designed to produce the us that inevitably defines that them. But if we were to understand community instead as multiple and diverse, right, as shifting entities that serve strategic purposes, we might be able to embrace community not as a declaration, but instead as an activity, right, as a process of building solidarity, of building coalitions. It's a way of rethinking who counts, right, of adding others to our numbers and adding ourselves to theirs. And this call for solidarity between the university and the communities outside its walls has been part of higher education's recent history, the subject of student-led calls for institutional change that spanned the 1960s and 1970s. Now, as Roderick Ferguson has detailed, those calls were not only met with deep resistance within the institution, but also in the governmental and corporate environment that oversaw it, leading to the political shifts whose apotheosis, and dear God, let this be the apotheosis, we are currently living through today. Right. In reaction, right, to that protest, our institutions, instead of tearing down their walls, instead turned inward. They became self-protective. They looked away from the possibility of building solidarity with the publics that the university was meant to serve. And so community, in the strategic sense that I hope to invoke it, is and has been the university's weakness when it should have been its strength. If we're going to save our institutions from the relentless economic and political forces that today threaten to undo them, we have to begin to understand campuses as sites where new kinds of communities and new kinds of solidarities can and must be built. However, in building those relationships, we have to contend with the fact that what faculty members actually do on our campuses is often a mystery, and indeed a site of profound misunderstanding for people outside the academic profession, and even at times for colleagues in other fields, right? One of the key areas of misunderstanding, and one that I think most needs opening up, is the fundamental purpose of higher education. Public figures such as politicians increasingly discuss colleges and universities as sites of workforce preparation, right? Making it seem as if the provision of career-enhancing credentials were the sole purpose for which our institutions exist, and as if everything else they do that does not lead directly to economic growth were a misappropriation of funds. Now, those of us who work on campus, by and large, understand our institutions not as credentialing agencies, but as sites of broad-based liberal education, right? Liberal education in the original sense of the term. Now, of course, the term liberal education, so natural to those of us who've been steeped in it for so long, has itself become profoundly politicized. As if the liberal aspect of the higher education that we provide were not its breadth, but its ideological bent. So we start seeing things, for instance, like the state of Colorado stripping the term out of official documents that describe the university. But even where the concept of liberal education isn't imagined to be some kind of cover for a revolution that we're secretly fomenting on campus, there's a widespread misconception about it that's almost worse, right? It's a mode of education in which we waste taxpayer resources by developing, disseminating, and filling our heads with useless knowledge that will not lead to a productive career path. And nowhere is this misconception more focused than on the humanities. Now, the portrait that I'm about to sketch of the humanities today could be extended to a lot of other areas within the curriculum. For instance, the sciences focus on basic science, right, or science without industry applicability, is often imagined to be just as frivolous. But the humanities, right, the study of literature, history, art, philosophy, and other forms of culture are in certain ways both the core and the limit case of the liberal arts. The humanities cultivate an inquisitive mindset, they teach key skills of reading and interpretation, and they focus on writing in ways that can prepare a student to learn absolutely anything else over the course of their lives. And yet, these are the fields about which no ends of hilarious jokes about what a student is going to do with that degree have been constructed, right? Of course, the answer is absolutely anything. And as a recent report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences makes clear, not only do humanities majors wind up gainfully employed, but they also wind up happy in what they do, right? But I digress. The key thing to note is that the humanities serve as a bellwether of sorts, right? What's been happening to the humanities on campus is slowly happening to higher education in general. So while I'm focused here on the kinds of arguments that are being made about the humanities in our culture today, it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to think of these same arguments being made about sociology, or about physics, or about any other field on campus that isn't named after a specific well-paying career, right? The humanities, in any case, have long been lauded as providing students with a rich set of interpretive, critical, and ethical skills with which they can engage the world around them. And these skills are increasingly necessary in today's hyper-mediated, globalized, conflict-filled world. And yet many humanities departments, happily not here, but at other institutions, find themselves increasingly marginalized on their own campuses, right? This marginalization is related, if not directly attributable, to the degree to which students, parents, administrators, trustees, politicians, the media, and the public at large have been led in this kind of self-reinforcing cycle to believe that the skills that these fields provide are useless in the current economic environment. So somebody particularly visible makes a publicly disparaging remark about all those English majors working at Starbucks. Commentators reinforce the sense that humanities majors are worth less than pre-professional degrees. Parents strongly encourage their students to turn toward pragmatic fields that somehow describe a job. Administrators note a decline in humanities majors and cut budgets and positions. The jobs crisis for humanities PhDs worsens. Someone particularly visible makes a publicly disparaging remark about what all those adjuncts were planning on doing with that humanities PhD anyhow, and the whole thing intensifies. So in many institutions, this draining away of majors and faculty and resources has reduced the humanities to a means of ensuring that students who are studying to become engineers and bankers are reminded of the human ends of their work. And that's not a terrible thing in and of itself, but it's not a sufficient ground on which the humanities can do its best work on behalf of the university, or for that matter, the world. And while this kind of cyclical crisis has not manifested to anything like the same extent in the sciences, there are some early indications that it's spreading in that direction. Where once the world at large seemed mostly to understand that scientific research and the kinds of study that support it are crucial to the general advancement of knowledge, I will get this out. Recent shifts in funder policies and priorities suggest a growing scrutiny of that work's economic rather than intellectual impact, as well as a growing restriction on research areas that have been heavily politicized. So the humanities, again, may well be the canary in the higher education coal mine. And for that reason, I think it's really crucial that we pay attention to what hasn't worked in trying to save the humanities, and particularly, to what's happened in those fields, but also to what hasn't worked as we have attempted to save the humanities. Now, one of the key things that hasn't worked is the impassioned plea, right, on behalf of the field. A welter of defenses from both inside and outside the humanities have been published in recent years, each of which has wound up seeming slightly more defensive than the last, and none of which have really had the desired impact. And calls to save the humanities issued by public figures, for instance, frequently leave scholars really annoyed, as those defenses often begin with a somewhat retrograde sense of what it is we do and why. And thus they sometimes give the sense of trying to save the field from us. One might see, for instance, in this line, a column published in 2016 by the former chairman of the NEH, Bruce Cole, entitled "What's Wrong with the Humanities?" Which begins memorably. Let's face it, too many humanities scholars are alienating students and the public with their opacity, triviality, and irrelevance. Oh, thanks, Bruce. But even worse, I think, is the degree to which humanities professors themselves, I mean, those one would think best positioned to make the case on behalf of their fields, have really failed to find traction with their arguments. And as these unsuccessful defenses have proliferated, the public view of the humanities has become all the worse, leading Simon During to grumble that whatever things the humanities do well, it is beginning to look as if promoting themselves is not among them. And maybe we like it that way, right? As we're often the ones who take issue with our own defenses, bitterly disagreeing, as we frequently do, about the purposes and practices of our fields. So perhaps this is a good moment for us to stop and consider what it is the humanities do well, right? What the humanities are for. So I'm going to start with the basic definition of the humanities as a cluster of fields that focus on the careful study and analysis of cultures and their many modes of thought and forms of representation, writing, art, media, and so on, as they've developed and moved through time and across geographical boundaries, growing out of and adding to our senses of who we are as individuals, as groups, and as nations. So the humanities are interested then in ways that representations work, right? In the relationships between representations and social structures, and in all of the ways that human ideas and their expression shape and are shaped by human culture. So in a definition like this one, we might begin to see the possibility that studying literature or history or art or film or philosophy might not be solely about the object itself, but instead about a way of engaging with the world, right? In the process, we develop the ability to read and interpret what we see and hear, the insight to understand the multiple layers of what's being communicated and why, and the capacity to put together for ourselves an appropriate, thoughtful contribution to that culture. Now, the first thing to note about this definition is that I am certain that many humanities scholars who hear it will disagree with parts of it. They'll have nuances and correctives to offer, and I think it's important to understand that this disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that my definition is wrong, but nor do I mean to suggest that the nuances and correctives that would be offered would be wrong. Rather, that form of disagreement is at the heart of how we do what we do, right? We hear one another's interpretations of texts, of performances, of historical events, and we push back against them, right? And this is how we advance the work in our field, through disagreement and revision. This agonistic approach, however, I want to argue is both a strength of the humanities and by extension a strength of the university in general and its Achilles heel, which is a thought that I'm going to come back to in a bit. But for the moment, back to Simon During and his sense that the humanities are terrible at self-promotion. During's complaint, which is leveled at the essays in Peter Brooks and Hilary Jewett's volume, The Humanities and Public Life, is largely that, as he says, in the act of self-defense, humanities scholars leave behind doing what they do and turn instead to sermonizing, his word, about the value of what they do. I mean, he argues that part of the problem is the very assumption that the humanities as we practice them ought to have a public life in the first place. He winds up suggesting that we should continue to ensure that there's sufficient state support, this is, under the UK system, right? Sufficient state support for the humanities so that students who don't already occupy a position of financial comfort can study our fields, but that we shouldn't stretch beyond that point by arguing for the public importance of studying the humanities because that importance, he says, is primarily overwhelmingly private. Now, this sense that education in the humanities is of primarily private value is increasingly in today's popular discourse extended to higher education in general, right? The purpose, we are told, of a college degree is some form of personal enrichment, whether financial or otherwise, rather than a social good. And this privatization of higher education's benefits, right, part of the general privatization that Chris Newfield has described as the Academy's great mistake, has been accompanied by a related shift in costs from the state to individual families and students, resulting in the downward spiral in funding and other forms of public support in which our institutions and our fields are caught, as well as the astronomically increasing debt load faced by students and their families. As long as a university education is assumed to have a predominantly personal rather than social benefit, it will be argued that making such an education possible is a private rather than a public responsibility. And that mindset will of necessity lead to the devaluation of fields whose benefits are less immediately tangible or material or individual. If we are to correct course, right, if we're going to restore public support for our institutions and our fields, we have to find ways to make clear the public goals that our fields have and the public good that our institutions serve. But what is that public good? We don't always do a really good job of articulating these things, of describing and arguing on behalf of the values that sustain our work. That may be in part because it's hard to express our values without recourse to what feel to us like politically regressive, universalizing master narratives about the nature of the good that have long been used as means of solidifying and perpetuating the social order with all its injustices and exclusions. And so instead of stating clearly and passionately the ethics and values and goals that we bring to our work, we wind up critiquing, right? We protect ourselves with what Lisa Ruddick has described as the game of academic cool. In order to avoid appearing naive or worse, complicit, we complicate, right? We argue, we read against the grain. And one of the things that happens when we engage in this mode of critique is that we get accused of having primarily ideological ends, right? This is how our universities come to be accused of brainwashing their students, right? Of filling their heads with leftist rejections of the basic goodness of the dominant Western culture. Now, on campus, of course, we know this isn't true. Our classes in American history and in English literature may strive to teach the full range of that history and of that literature, but Western culture is far from being marginalized in the curriculum. And, in fact, even our most critical reading practices turn out to be perfectly compatible with the contemporary political landscape. In fact, in the larger project, I end up arguing that our critiques of contemporary culture surface not just despite, but in fact because of the conservative-leaning systems and structures in which the university as a whole and each of us as a result are mired. Our tendency to read against the grain is part of our makeup precisely because of the ways that we are ourselves subject to politics, right, rather than being able to stand outside and neutrally analyze the political. The politics that we're subject to, one that structures all institutions in the contemporary United States, and perhaps especially universities, makes inevitable the critical, the negative, the rejection of everything that's gone before. It's a politics that's structured around competition, and what historian Winfried Fluck has referred to as the race for individual distinction. However much we might reject individualism as part and parcel of the neoliberal mainstream, our working lives, on campus and off, are overdetermined by it. The entire academic enterprise serves to cultivate individualism, in fact. From college admissions through the entirety of our careers, those of us on campus are subject to selection. Right? The processes present themselves as meritocratic. Right? There are some metrics for quality against which we are measured, and the best, whatever that might mean in a general context, are rewarded. But in actual practice, however, our metrics are never neutral, and what we're measured against is far more often than not one another. We're in constant competition for positions, for resources, for acclaim. And the drive to compete that this mode of being instills in us can't ever be fully contained by those processes. It bleeds out into all of the ways that we work, even when we're working together. Right? Hence the danger of those agonistic modes of work. Too often the agon is turned against one another, discrediting competing theories rather than building on the work that's come before us. So this competitive individualism, I would argue, contradicts and undermines, in fact, all of the most important communal aspects of life within our institutions of higher education. Our principles of shared governance, for instance, are built on the notion that universities best operate as collectives, in which all members contribute to their direction and functioning. But in actual practice, our all too clear understanding that service to the institution will not count when faculty are evaluated and ranked for salary increases and tenure and promotion encourages us to avoid that labor, right? To reserve our time and energy for those aspects of our work that will enable our individual achievement. And the results aren't good for any of us, right? Faculty disengage from their colleagues and from the functioning of the institution and the shared purposes that it serves, while university governance becomes increasingly managed by administrators, no offense to administrators, ostensibly freeing up the faculty to focus on the competitive work that will allow us as individuals and our universities as institutions to climb the rankings. Right? This is no way to run a collective, and it's also no way to build solidarity among academic units or across categories of academic employment or between the academy and the communities which it serves. And perhaps that's the point, right? Perhaps we're locked into this endless competition with one another in order to keep us distracted from the work that we might do if we were truly joined together. The requirement that we continually compare ourselves with one another, that we take on only the work that will lead to our own individual achievement, is inseparable from the privatization that Newfield describes as the political unconscious of the contemporary university. So competition and the race for individual distinction structure the growing conviction that not only the benefits of higher education, but also all of our categories of success can only ever be personal, private, and individual rather than social. So how do we step off this treadmill? And how do we begin to insist upon living our academic lives a different way? How do we return to the collective, the social, the communal potential that higher education should enable? And this, at last, is where I get to bring in generous thinking, and a way of being that I propose as an alternative to the competitive thinking in which the academy is steeped. Generous thinking is not intended to be opposed to critical thinking, right? In fact, I argue strongly that the best of our critical thinking is always steeped in generosity. Rather, generous thinking involves the wholehearted embrace of the deepest values of the humanities, and among them, attention, care, and equity, in order to create communities that can think critically together, both on campus and across the campus borders. So what is it I mean when I talk about generosity in this context? The book obviously spends a lot more time unpacking this, but for the moment, I think of generosity as a practice, right? Something that we have to return to again and again. It's an approach to engagement that focuses first and foremost on developing a generosity of mind, an openness to possibility. And that openness begins for me by trying to develop a sort of listening presence in the world, which is to say a conversational disposition, I can get the words out, a conversational disposition that's not merely waiting for my next opportunity to speak, but that's instead genuinely paying attention to what's being said, right? It means caring about the concerns of my interlocutor as much as I care about my own. It means beginning from the assumption that in any given exchange, I likely have less to teach than I have to learn. Generous thinking also means working to think with rather than against people and the texts with whom I'm in dialogue. And it means starting an encounter with an idea with yes rather than no, right? With and rather than but. Yes and creates the possibility for genuine dialogue, not just among academic colleagues, but with our objects of study, with our predecessors, and with the many potential publics that surround us. Yes and asks us to step away from competition, right, from the race for professional distinction. And when we allow ourselves to linger in that yes and, we create the possibility of working together to create something entirely new. And it's through working together, ultimately, that we can begin to build the kinds of connections with the publics that might help turn the tide on the declining esteem that our institutions and higher education in general are held in. This mode of generous thinking, I think, is already instantiated in a very wide range of projects that focus on fostering public engagement in and through the work that's being done on college and university campuses today. And collaborations like this with the public can work to create a sense of collective ownership of and investment in the university, making the institution's relevance to contemporary communities abundantly clear. But this mode of working in public asks a lot of us, right? It asks us to stop disseminating our work solely in the venues that give us the greatest chance at the forms of individual prestige for which we're usually rewarded, and instead start looking for ways to make our work a gift to the world. It asks us to accept the risk that's involved in writing for audiences with whom we're less familiar than we are our colleagues, finding ways to draw them into our concerns and acquaint ourselves with theirs. It asks us not just to bring our knowledge to those audiences, but to open space for them to become interlocutors, right? Bringing their own knowledge to us in response. It takes a lot of work, right? Really difficult, scary, failure-filled work to allow ourselves to become open to this kind of engagement. I mean, we're prone as scholars to focus on conversations with those we already know well and in forms we already know how to do well. And there are times when our attempts to address broader public audiences go badly. I mean, it's possible that Simon During is on to something here, right? When he notes that humanities professors, in the act of public professing, turn away from doing what they do and instead towards sermonizing about our field's value. But the problem isn't assuming, as he suggests, that there is a public value in what we do. It's rather the mode of sermonizing, right? Too much, and I recognize there is a deep irony in having stood in front of you for 35 minutes talking and saying what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. Too much public professional address takes the form or the tone of the edifying lecture, right? Instructing the less privileged on better ways of being. I mean, if, contra During, we really do believe that there's a public value to the work of the humanities, we have to find ways to engage the public as equals without sermonizing. We have to prepare for and accept the vulnerability involved in doing away with the hierarchy of teacher and learner, and find ways to engage in open-ended, multi-directional, generous conversation. And in that conversation lies the possibility of building solidarity, right, with the publics, the concerns of the publics we hope to reach, as well as the possibility of encouraging understanding of our own concerns, right? In that conversation, and in the conversations you're going to be engaging in for the next few hours, lies the possibility of creating another mode of being for the 21st century university and for those who care about it. In that conversation lies the possibility of developing a new understanding of how expertise is structured and how it functions. In that conversation lies the possibility of a higher education whose ends are social rather than individual, aimed at community building rather than individual achievement. In all of those conversations, in which we engage perspectives other than our own, in which we value the productions and manifestations of our diverse culture, in which we encounter the other in its irreducible otherness, lie the best of what the humanities can bring to the university and the university to the world. So what's next is in your hands, right? You've got a few hours of challenging conversations ahead of you, and I will so look forward to rejoining you afterward to find out where all of this has taken you. Thank you very much.